Hey guys, tonight we're diving into something a little strange and fascinating, the world of Viking beer brewing. Imagine yourself in a smoky longhouse, the air thick with the scent of roasted barley and earthy herbs, as a group of Vikings carefully craft a batch of their famous ale. You've been watching for hours wondering if you'll make it through without falling asleep. But don't worry, these Vikings have their way of keeping things lively. The hum of the fire, the crackling wood, and the ancient rituals of brewing make this process far more than just making beer. It's about preserving life tradition and their very essence as a culture. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'd love to hear from you too. Where are you tuning in from? What time is it over there? Feel free to drop a comment. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. As we begin, let's think about Viking beer as more than just a drink. The ancient Vikings, those legendary seafarers and warriors, didn't just brew beer for fun. They brewed it with purpose, with deep spiritual and social significance. Beer was a central part of their lives, used in rituals for healing, and of course at feasts. But let's start at the beginning, shall we? Let's look at the ingredients they used, which were key to crafting the rich, hearty beers they enjoyed. Now the Vikings had access to some very unique resources that gave their beer its distinct taste. This wasn't just your average ale, it was brewed from local grains and flavoured with wild herbs and roots. But what were those ingredients? What exactly made Viking beer stand out from what we know today? As we step into the brewing process, imagine yourself kneeling next to a Viking brewer, watching them prepare the ingredients with skill and care. It wasn't just any old grain that went into Viking beer. It was the barley and oats that grew in the northern lands, grains that could withstand the harsh conditions. Vikings often used a mixture of both, choosing them for their hearty flavours and their ability to thrive in the cooler climates. You might even be surprised to learn that their barley wasn't the same kind we're used to today. Vikings had their own varieties, often grown on small homesteads, and tended to with great care. They didn't have the mass production methods we see now, so every batch of beer was essentially crafted with a personal touch. But let's not stop there. The real magic came from what these brewers did with the grains. The first step was malting, which, if you're picturing something fancy, let's slow it down a bit. It was a simple yet effective process. The grain was soaked in water, allowing it to begin germinating. Then it was dried in the sun, sometimes with the help of a fire. This malting process unlocked the sugars in the grain, setting the stage for fermentation. And you know what? This whole process had some quirky results. Some say the Vikings' barley even picked up unique flavours from the local soil and weather conditions. Whether it was an accident or an intentional part of their brewing process, it's clear that the Vikings knew how to use nature's power to create something truly special. But there's still so much mystery here. Historians still argue over exactly how much the Vikings understood the science behind malting and fermentation. Were they just using trial and error, or did they have a deeper understanding of how these natural processes worked? Some believe that their brewing knowledge was passed down through generations, refined over time. Others think that a bit of magic and luck were involved. Either way, these early brewers knew how to harness the power of nature, and it shows in the final product. Viking beer wasn't just a drink, it was a blend of nature, skill, and mystery. Now that we've talked about the grains and the malting process, let's move on to one of the most essential ingredients in Viking beer, the water. You might not think about it much when you grab a bottle of beer today, but for the Vikings, water was a crucial part of the brewing process. They didn't just pull water from any old stream. Oh no, the Vikings had a deep reverence for nature, and they often sought out water from sacred or mystical springs believed to hold special qualities. These springs were thought to be blessed by the gods, which is why they were used not just for brewing, but for everything from daily drinking to ritualistic practices. The Vikings didn't just pick water randomly, they selected it carefully to ensure it was pure and full of life. Some of the water was sourced from fast-moving streams, where the flow was said to invigorate the brew, adding a certain freshness to the final product. And the process of sourcing water wasn't just practical, it was also spiritual. Water in Viking culture was associated with life and fertility, and it played a key role in connecting the physical world to the divine. So when the brewers poured water into their mash, they weren't just hydrating the grains, they were giving life to the beer, and in a sense to the soul of the deceased as well. Now you may be wondering just how much difference could water really make in brewing beer. Historians still argue about this. Some say that the quality of the water was essential to the final flavour, while others believe it was more about the ambience and spiritual connection to nature. Was water simply a necessary ingredient, or did it have a deeper, almost magical role in the brewing process? What we do know is that Viking brewers took great care in selecting their water, ensuring it was the best they could find. Let's now move to the boiling stage of Viking beer brewing, where the magic really starts to unfold. Once the malted grain and water were combined, the mixture was boiled over an open flame. Picture it, a huge iron cauldron, bubbling over a crackling fire, steam rising into the air, the scent of boiling barley mixing with the fragrant herbs the Vikings added. The boiling wasn't just for sterilization though, that was part of it. It was a key step in extracting the sugars from the malted grain and infusing the beer with flavors. The Vikings didn't just boil their brew for the sake of it. No, they took the opportunity to add flavor too. You'd see them throwing handfuls of herbs, spices, and roots into the cauldron. Some of these were probably what we would now call bittering agents to balance the sweetness of the malt, but others were added for spiritual reasons. Herbs, like juniper berries, honey, and even myrtle leaves would be thrown in not just to give the beer a distinctive taste, but also to invoke the blessings of the gods. After all, this wasn't just brewing, it was a sacred act, and the ingredients weren't just for flavour, they were believed to offer protection and power. In Viking times, the act of boiling was also a symbolic preparation. The brew was being transformed, just like the body, in the mummification process we talked about earlier. You could almost think of it as a kind of spiritual cooking where the ingredients came together to create something entirely new, a beverage that connected the physical world with the divine. And it wasn't just about what the beer tasted like, it was about ensuring that it would be the perfect offering to the gods and a vital part of the feasts that marked important occasions in Viking life. Yet historians still debate the role of boiling. Was it purely a functional process, or did the Vikings see it as a ritualistic step to sanctify the beer and its makers? Some believe it was a blend of both, as Vikings often found themselves living in an environment where survival and spirituality were intertwined. But regardless of the true intent, it's clear that the boiling stage was vital, transforming a basic liquid into the potent symbolic beverage that Viking brewers were so proud of. As the brew continued to boil, something important was happening in the Viking brewing process, the fermentation stage. Now, fermentation is where the yeast comes into play, and for the Vikings, this was both an art and a bit of a mystery. They didn't have the modern yeast strains we use today. Instead, they relied on wild yeasts that floated around in the air or were naturally present on the surface of the ingredients. And here's where things get interesting. Historians still debate whether the Vikings intentionally used these wild yeasts or if they were simply a happy accident. Either way, the Vikings seemed to know how to harness them. You can imagine the scene once the beer had been cooled down. After the boil, the mixture was left to ferment in wooden barrels or clay pots, often in dark, cool corners of the longhouse. Over time, the wild yeasts would begin their work, transforming the sugars from the malt into alcohol. The process could take several days or even weeks, depending on the conditions and the strength of the yeast. In Viking society, the fermentation was likely guided by intuition and experience rather than science. But the brewers knew when the beer was ready. They might have tested the brew with a taste, or even a prayer to the gods, checking for the right balance of sweetness and alcohol. Now let's take a moment to reflect on how wild and unpredictable this process must have seemed. The Vikings weren't exactly brewing with the precision we have today. They didn't have temperature-controlled environments or knowledge of yeast strains, yet they managed to create beers with varying alcohol content and flavors. Was it all by chance, or was there some hidden brewing wisdom passed down through generations? Some argue that the Vikings knew more than we give them credit for, and that they had their own form of brewing science, even if it wasn't documented. Others suggest that the process was more a blend of tradition, trial, and error. and divine intervention. Either way, fermentation was a key step in Viking beer brewing, and it set the stage for the final transformation of the liquid into something that was both functional and spiritual. As the beer fermented, it grew more potent and more symbolic, an offering to the gods, a drink of sustenance for the afterlife, and a key part of Viking feasts and rituals. Once the fermentation was complete, Viking brewers faced one final important task: the filtration and final preparation of the beer. Now, the Vikings didn't have fine mesh filters or modern techniques to strain their brew, so they used simple yet effective methods. Often, the beer was poured through cloth or fine straining materials to remove any leftover barley particles, hops, or wild yeast, resulting in a clearer, smoother beverage. But what's really fascinating is that the Vikings didn't seem to mind a little bit of sediment in their beer. It was quite common for Viking brews to have a cloudy, hearty texture, which might have added to the rustic charm of their beer. It was part of the experience, part of the connection to the earth and nature that the Vikings so deeply respected. The final beer, though, wasn't just about the clarity of the liquid. It was about the community and rituals surrounding it. Imagine the scene as the finished beer was ladled into horns or wooden drinking vessels. It was time for the feasts. The beer was served alongside meat, bread, and other offerings, but more importantly, it played a central role in the social and spiritual aspects of Viking life. Drinking beer wasn't just about satisfying thirst, it was an essential part of ritual bonding, and even the performance of important ceremonies. As the drink passed from hand to hand, so did the prayers, the songs, and the stories of the gods. Historians still debate the exact role of beer in Viking feasts. Some believe it was primarily a social drink, used to lubricate the flow of conversation and create bonds within the community. Others think it had more profound spiritual significance, helping connect the living with the gods and ancestors. Whatever the truth, it's clear that Viking beer was far more than just a beverage. It was a key component of Viking culture, binding the community together and ensuring that the afterlife would be just as plentiful and enjoyable as life itself. This transition from a basic raw brew to a final ceremonial product illustrates how the Vikings saw their beer as both a functional drink and a sacred offering. The beer wasn't just about enjoyment, it was a link between worlds, a drink that could sustain not only the body, but the spirit as well. And even though the Vikings had no idea how yeast worked scientifically, they understood its power and role in creating a drink that was central to their rituals. Now, with the beer finally prepared and ready for consumption, let's step into the grand Viking feasts, where this brew played such an important role. Picture the scene: long wooden tables filled with bread-roasted meats and large ornate drinking horns filled with beer. It was the moment where Viking warriors, farmers and travellers gathered to celebrate their victories, honour their gods, or simply enjoy the warmth of the community. The beer was passed around, freely shared by all, and its consumption marked the communal bond of the Viking people. But Viking beer wasn't just a drink, it was part of the feast's spiritual fabric. As the beer was poured into horns and goblets, offerings and prayers were often made to the gods. Many Viking feasts would involve toasts where warriors would raise their cups to the gods, to the deceased, or to the king. This practice was deeply symbolic. The beer was often considered an offering to the gods, ensuring divine favour and protection. In some cases, the beer was poured as a libation onto the ground, or to the ancestors, an act to honour those who had passed and to ensure the fertility of the land. This wasn't just a party, it was a ritual, a way of participating in the sacred and ensuring that the afterlife would be as bountiful as the present life. Historians still argue whether these Viking feasts and their associated drinking rituals were more about politics and social control, or about genuine religious beliefs. Some suggest that feasts were a way for Viking leaders to solidify their power by giving away beer and food, making their followers loyal and indebted. Others argue that the ritualistic elements were the true driving force behind the feasts, the belief that the gods would look favourably upon the community if the proper offerings were made. Whether it was a political tool or a genuine expression of faith, the beer played an undeniable role in both. The significance of beer during these feasts was clear. It was the drink of the gods, the drink of life, and the drink that linked the living with the dead. And whether they were celebrating victory or mourning a fallen warrior, Vikings turned to their beer to seal the occasion. It was an essential part of both their earthly life and their spiritual existence. But as much as Viking beer was celebrated in feasts and rituals, it also had a more practical side. It wasn't just a luxury drink reserved for special occasions. Beer played an essential role in Viking daily life. You see, the Vikings didn't have the variety of beverages we enjoy today. No sodas, no juices, no coffee. For them, beer was the go-to drink, whether they were having a meal, heading out on a long journey, or even using it as a form of sustenance during harsh winters. It was their everyday drink, much like how we might reach for a glass of water today, but with far more significance. The Vikings used beer to hydrate, nourish, and even to preserve their health. The brewing process, combined with the fermentation of wild yeasts, helped to create a mildly alcoholic drink that could safely be consumed without the risk of harmful bacteria that contaminated water sources. In a world where the water wasn't always safe to drink, beer became a key part of the Viking diet, providing not only hydration, but also vitamins, minerals, and calories that were necessary for their daily survival. Historians have also speculated that beer could have been used as a type of medicine, as it was often made with herbal ingredients like juniper berries and other plants known for their healing properties. Viking brewers would have understood the benefits of these herbs long before modern medicine could explain why they worked. Some Viking communities even created specific medicinal beers brewed with ingredients aimed at treating ailments like digestive issues or inflammation. These early beers may have acted as tonics, promoting health, while still being enjoyable to drink. Yet while beer had many practical uses, it was still deeply tied to the Vikings' spirituality. Even during the simplest of daily meals, the act of drinking beer wasn't merely for quenching thirst, it was about connecting to the divine. As you drink, you're not just partaking in sustenance, you're participating in a long tradition that links you to the gods, ancestors, and the natural world. Now let's take a step back and think about the role of beer in Viking society beyond just drinking it during feasts or daily life. Viking beer was a symbol of status, power, and wealth. The amount of beer you could offer at a feast or to your guests was seen as a reflection of your wealth and generosity. Leaders and high-ranking officials would have brewed and offered the finest beers, often adding rare ingredients and crafting elaborate rituals around them to show their prestige. The best brews were usually reserved for important guests or divine purposes, while the more humble beer might be served to lower-ranking members of society. It wasn't just the beer itself that reflected status, but also the vessels it was served in. The Viking beer mugs, made from wood, horns, or metal, were not just functional. They were often elaborately carved or decorated, showcasing the wealth and craftsmanship of their owners. Drinking from a beautifully crafted vessel wasn't just about the experience of drinking, it was a statement, a visual sign of one's position within the social hierarchy. Imagine yourself at one of these Viking feasts, drinking from a horn, adorned with intricate carvings, the rich amber beer glistening in the dim candlelight. It wasn't just the beer you were sharing, it was a shared cultural moment, a celebration of status and tradition. Historians often debate the connection between wealth and beer in Viking society. Was beer just another commodity that distinguished the rich from the poor, or was it more deeply embedded in their belief systems and social structures? Some scholars argue that beer, along with other offerings, reinforced a system where the elite were seen as divine figures connected to the gods by their ability to offer the finest beer and the most elaborate feasts. Others believe that beer was a unifying force, something that bridged the gap between classes, allowing even the poorest Vikings to partake in the same rituals, to connect with the gods and ancestors through a shared drink. Regardless of the debate, one thing is clear: beer in Viking culture was a symbol of more than just physical nourishment. It was an emblem of identity, status, and power. Whether it was consumed in a grand hall or a small village, it played a role in both daily life and spiritual practices. a drink that tied the living to the divine and the earthly to the otherworldly. As we reflect on the importance of beer in Viking society, let's shift gears and think about the ingredients that made this magical brew come to life. In the modern world, we're accustomed to hops as the defining ingredient of beer, but for the Vikings, hops weren't part of the picture. Instead, their beer was made with a variety of herbs, spices, and fruits' wild ingredients that grew naturally in their environment. They didn't need fancy hops or commercial yeast to make their brew. Instead, they harnessed the power of the wild, infusing their beer with the flavors of the land. Among the more unusual ingredients were herbs like juniper berries, myrtle, and yarrow. Juniper in particular was a common flavoring in Viking beer, and not just for taste. The berries were also believed to have protective qualities, warding off evil spirits and keeping the beer pure for consumption. These herbs were added to give the beer a distinct taste, one that was earthy, piney, and aromatic, but also deeply connected to the Viking worldview. The Vikings were masterful at blending the practical with the spiritual, using these wild plants not only for flavor, but also for their perceived magical properties. And then there was the honey. Viking beer often included honey as a sweetener, adding a richness to the brew that was both pleasing to the taste and symbolically important. Honey was revered in many cultures, but for the Vikings it was considered a sacred substance associated with the gods. It's believed that mead, the honeyed drink of the Vikings, was a special variation of their beer brewed for the elite or for ceremonial purposes. Drinking mead wasn't just about enjoying a sweet alcoholic beverage. It was an act of reverence, a way of connecting with the gods who were thought to favor honey above all other substances. Historians still argue whether these wild ingredients were used purely for flavor or whether the Vikings believed in their magical and medicinal properties. Some researchers think the plants and herbs were simply a part of the natural environment, while others believe the Vikings saw them as divine gifts, offering spiritual protection and strength. Either way, it's clear that the Vikings had a deep understanding of their natural world, using it to create a beverage that was as much about culture and belief as it was about taste. Now let's talk about the ancient Viking brewing methods and how they were as much about ritual as they were about creating a drink. The Vikings, like many ancient cultures, didn't approach brewing as a purely scientific process. For them, every step had meaning, whether it was the ingredients they selected or the time of year they brewed. Brewing was deeply intertwined with their spiritual practices, as it was an offering to the gods and a way to ensure prosperity for the community. The brewing process itself was communal, often performed during specific seasons when the harvest had been brought in and the days grew shorter. The Vikings brewed their beer at the turn of the seasons during the fall and winter months, when the long nights made it the perfect time for gathering and ritual. This time of year was also tied to key Viking festivals, where beer played a central role. Imagine a Viking longhouse, full of the warmth of a roaring fire and the murmur of voices as the entire community came together to brew beer. It wasn't just the brewers who participated. Everyone had a role. The entire village might gather to assist in grinding grain, preparing the herbs, or even assisting with the boiling process, each step creating a deeper sense of connection to the land, to the gods, and to each other. What's fascinating is that even though brewing was an everyday task, it had sacred undertones. It was as if every beer brewed was an offering to the gods, a way to ensure good fortune and divine favor. This is where Viking brewing differs significantly from modern brewing practices. Today, brewing is often a solitary technical endeavor, but for the Vikings it was a communal sacred ritual where every step was performed with a deep sense of reverence. Even the tools they used, wooden vats, stone mortars, and clay pots, were often crafted with care and imbued with spiritual significance. These tools weren't just functional, they were seen as sacred instruments for preparing a drink that would sustain the soul as much as the body. Historians still debate how much of the brewing process was ritualistic and how much was purely functional. Some suggest that it was largely a symbolic practice, while others argue that the spiritual beliefs surrounding beer had real practical effects on the brewing outcome. Either way, what's clear is that Viking beer was more than just a drink. It was a sacred elixir created through ritual belief and a deep connection to the natural world. As we continue exploring Viking beer, it's important to understand the unique role it played not just as a beverage, but as a spiritual medium during important ceremonies. Beer wasn't simply consumed at feasts, it was also used in rituals that honoured the gods and the ancestors. Imagine the scene, a large Viking hall filled with warriors and chieftains, the fire crackling in the hearth as the sound of chants fills the air. At the centre of the gathering, a ceremonial table is prepared with bowls of food offerings, of beer and intricate statues of gods. The beer itself brewed with wild herbs, and roots was seen as the vessel for communication with the divine. In Viking culture, drinking beer was part of a complex set of spiritual practices. The beer was often consumed in toasts to the gods, but it also had a special place in funerary rituals. When a Viking warrior died, for example, the community would gather to celebrate their life, honouring them with a final drink of beer accompanied by prayers and incantations. This was not just a farewell to a fallen comrade, it was an offering to the gods to ensure that the soul of the deceased would be protected in the afterlife. These rites were not only for the elite, even commoners would use beer in rituals, though perhaps on a smaller scale. The inclusion of beer in rituals emphasized its sacred nature and its role as a medium between the living and the divine. Historians still debate the full extent to which Vikings believed in the power of their beer during these rituals. Were the toasts and ceremonies seen as practical acts to ensure success and protection in the afterlife? Or was it more about reinforcing their connection to the divine? A symbolic gesture that comforted the living while honouring the dead? It's hard to say for sure. But what is clear is that beer played a key role in Viking life, not just as a social drink, but as an essential part of their spiritual practices. What we do know is that beer served as more than just a drink in Viking culture. It was a medium for spiritual connection and a means of securing divine favour. Whether you were raising your cup to the gods or offering it to a deceased loved one, beer was always part of a much larger ceremonial context, where the boundaries between the living and the gods were blurred. The Vikings understood beer to be an essential part of life, and death a bridge between worlds. As we delve deeper into Viking beer, it's fascinating to think about how their brewing process and consumption habits influenced their daily lives beyond feasts and rituals. Beer wasn't just a ceremonial drink, it was deeply integrated into Viking culture as a social lubricant, much like how we use alcohol today, to unwind or bond with others. But the Vikings had a more communal view of drinking. Beer was not only something to enjoy, but something to share and connect over. Viking beer was often consumed during gatherings, both large and small. Think of a long winter evening where a group of villagers would come together around a fire to share stories, sing songs and drink from horns filled with beer. It wasn't just about the beer itself. It was about the experience, the conversations that flowed, the laughter that echoed, and the community that was built over these simple yet meaningful moments. The beer helped establish bonds between people, whether they were celebrating victories or simply surviving harsh winters. These gatherings fueled by beer were essential to maintaining the social fabric of Viking life. They were places where allegiances were formed, information was exchanged, and the strength of the community was solidified. Interestingly, beer also played a role in Viking law and governance. Some Viking laws, particularly in the more northern regions, required that public feasts and gatherings be held to settle disputes and make decisions. The idea was that these gatherings, where beer was freely consumed, would allow for more relaxed and open discussions, leading to fairer decisions. Beer in this context helped create an atmosphere of equality, where even the lowliest of villagers could voice their opinions, though always with the understanding that the bond created by beer also demanded respect for authority. Historians still debate how much beer influenced Viking social structure and governance. Some argue that beer was a tool of control used by the elite to keep the masses happy and cooperative, while others see it as a natural extension of the Vikings' deeply communal way of life. Was it a social necessity that helped the Vikings stay united, or did the consumption of beer create a level of social harmony that went beyond mere custom? Either way, it's clear that beer wasn't just for pleasure. It played a role in shaping the Viking way of life, influencing everything from politics to personal relationships. Viking beer also had its place in the practicalities of daily life. In a world without refrigeration and modern preservation methods, beer was more than just a drink. It was an essential part of the Viking diet, helping them survive through long winters when fresh food was scarce. This wasn't just a luxury, beer was a source of hydration and calories, filling the gap left by limited food options. It was often drunk during meals, not just as a social beverage, but as a necessary part of maintaining strength and health. In fact, beer was one of the few drinks that could be safely consumed in Viking society. Without the modern knowledge we have of clean water, many Vikings avoided drinking untreated water, fearing that it could lead to illness. Instead, they relied on beer, which, due to its fermentation process, was generally safe to drink. The alcohol content was low enough that it didn't lead to intoxication, but high enough to prevent bacterial contamination. So for Vikings, beer was both a life-sustaining beverage and a cultural staple, making it integral to their survival in a harsh and unpredictable environment. But beer was also used for medicinal purposes, believed to have healing properties that could cure a variety of ailments. Some Vikings brewed specific medicinal beers infused with herbs like juniper berries, yarrow, or other plants known for their therapeutic benefits. These medicinal beers were often prescribed for anything from digestive issues to wounds, with the herbs providing both physical and spiritual healing. The belief in the healing power of beer was deeply embedded in Viking culture, where a strong connection to nature and the gods meant that many remedies were seen as both practical and spiritual. Whether it was to treat a cold, boost strength, or even ward off evil spirits. Viking beer had its place in the Viking medicine chest, and the brewing process itself could be seen as a type of magical ritual. Historians debate how much of this belief in the medicinal qualities of beer was based on real, tangible health benefits versus spiritual practices. Did Vikings genuinely understand the medicinal properties of their herbs, or were they simply using beer as a form of comfort and ritual? Some believe that beer's role in healing was a form of placebo effect, providing comfort through faith, while others argue that certain ingredients like juniper or honey may have had real therapeutic effects. Regardless, beer was undoubtedly woven into every aspect of Viking life, from feasts to healing to spiritual protection. As we reach the end of our journey through the history of Viking beer, let's take a moment to consider its lasting legacy. Viking beer wasn't just a drink, it was an integral part of Viking society, connecting the Vikings to their gods, their ancestors, and to each other. It was a symbol of their culture, a reflection of their values, and a medium through which they communicated with the divine. Though the specific brewing techniques of the Vikings may have faded over time, their influence on modern brewing is undeniable. Interestingly, Viking beer continued to influence Scandinavian brewing traditions for centuries after the Viking Age. Even today, many of the brewing techniques used by the Vikings are still practiced in various forms, especially in Nordic countries. Many modern Scandinavian breweries still use ingredients like juniper berries, honey, and other natural herbs in their beers, and some even craft beers that are inspired by the ancient Viking recipes. So in a sense, the Viking legacy lives on in every glass of beer poured in those regions. And yet historians still argue about the true significance of Viking beer. Was it purely a practical necessity, or was it a spiritual experience that helped shape the worldview of the Vikings? Some believe that beer played a far more important role than just a drink. It was a bridge between the living and the gods, a way of ensuring divine favour and connection to the afterlife. Others think it was simply a communal beverage used to strengthen social bonds and mark important moments. Either way, it's clear that beer was far more than just an alcoholic beverage for the Vikings. It was an essential part of their culture, their survival, and their spiritual practices. As we close tonight's story, imagine yourself sitting in a Viking longhouse, drinking from a horn, surrounded by friends and family, toasting to the gods and to the adventures yet to come. The beer you drink is not just a drink, it's a symbol of connection, of heritage, of shared history. So when you crack open a cold one tonight, think of the Vikings and maybe raise a glass in their honour. May their spirits and their beer live on in the stories we tell and the drinks we share.